All right, let's have a dig now into the SoluLINK product portfolio. And I did mention earlier on, we're going to be looking at the kits themselves, or focusing on the kits. And I've split them into two groups. We'll look at the antibody and protein conjugation kits, and we'll look at oligonucleotide conjugation kits. So here's the selection of antibody conjugation kits, and the reason why, again, I'm focusing on the kits, just to reiterate or emphasize the fact in that, again, this is an introduction to bioconjugation, and I think a very easy way to become familiar with the techniques, the requirements, would be to go with complete detection kits, something that includes all the necessary components and reagents to perform the bioconjugation reliably, to give you confidence then to go forward and perhaps use separate linkers later on or explore other opportunities. So that's why I'm focusing on the kit formats. These are complete detection kits, or complete conjugation kits, I should say, rather, that include all the necessary components. A great segue into exploring the really exciting field of bioconjugation. So there is a bioendodoxagenin kits. We've got a phycoerythrin kit, fluorescein labeling kit, and perhaps not surprisingly, a peroxidase conjugation kit as well. So very quickly, we have two biotinylation kits. One is specifically for antibodies. It's referred to as a one-shot antibody biotinylation kit, and another one would be for proteins other than antibodies. I've listed it here. And biotin's used for a lot of different reasons, and I'm sure that most of our listeners out there have used biotin conjugates in one or another different formats. So both of these biotinylation kits, referred to as ChromaLink biotin kits, use this particular compound, and this is similar to the biotin NHS that I showed earlier on. If you look at it, you'll notice very quickly that these biotin compounds are indeed heterobifunctional linkers. Here's the reactive group that'll bind to your primary amine groups on your antibody, and here's the biotin over here that will be accessible for subsequent avidin, streptavidin, or indeed an antibiotin antibody. What is different here, though, is there is a very long chain spacer arm. It's a hydrophilic PEG spacer arm that helps in solubility of the particular linker, and also it separates the biotin a little further away from the antibody to prevent things such as steric hindrance, to enable this biotin to be accessible for subsequent binding. And you will see here, as we've been mentioning about the conjugation of the HiNic and the 4FB, you do get this hydrazone chromophore being incorporated in this linker. And that's important for a couple of reasons, particularly with these biotinylation kits. Number one, you'll see here that there is a significant time saving in that you don't have to run a Haber assay. A Haber assay is a colorimetric assay. And I've got here that some other kits do include that or recommend running a Haber assay for biotin quantitation. But with the hydrazone chromophore, you can get away with just a 5-minute UV scan to identify that conjugation has occurred, and you can actually quantify the biotin. But the other thing that my colleague Byron always reminds me of is that the Haber assay underreports the amount of, I'd say consistently underreports, the amount of biotin that's actually incorporated on a given target. So in that case, it's an inferior way of measuring or quantifying biotin in these particular bioconjugation methodologies. And certainly, this just shows you how you can use this particular chromophore. You read it at 354 nanometers, and this is actually a bovine IgG biotinylated with one of the ChromaLink biotin kits. This shows you, biotin to protein molar equivalents. Obviously, when you read it under the spectrophotometer at that given wavelength, you can easily quantify the amount of biotin that's on there. Okay, this brings us to the doxagenin kit. Very quickly, Here's the dig over here that'll be bound by an anti-dig antibody. Incorporated here is this long chain hydrophilic PEG spacer, performing very similar, solubility roles that I mentioned earlier for the biotin. Here's this particular chromophore again to allow or enable quantification with that quick UV scan. And here's the reactive group that'll bind to your amine groups on the antibody. So this particular kit, the digoxygenin antibody labeling kit, allows you to link the digoxygenin onto an antibody, for example. Thinking, okay, that's great, Craig. What sort of applications can I use these for? And I've just listed over here on the right-hand side, just some bullet points on how they can be applied. One of the more interesting applications here actually was multi-plexed immunofluorescence staining, whereby two mouse primary antibodies, I should say one was conjugated with the biotin, another one with the digoxygenin kit, and then subsequently detected using other fluorophore conjugates. But nonetheless, I've got an example here of a sandwich ELISA using a ChromaLink biotin kit. This particular capture antibody was plated, the antigen was captured, and then this detection antibody was conjugated with ChromaLink. Here's your streptavidin, your enzyme, and then they read that particular reaction. So this just gives you some ideas of how these kits are used out there. We also have the point here about using magnetic beads as well. Could be a streptavidin magnetic bead for pulling out biotinylated antibodies or proteins, for example. Right, so let's toggle now to just some of these other complete antibody kits that we've got. And one is the phycoerythrin kit. It puts a red fluorophore phycoerythrin on antibodies. And we've got the peroxidase antibody kit as well. And this particular diagram here just shows what we've been representing all through the webinar. Your antibody being bound by the HiNic compound, the HRP enzyme conjugated to 4FB, and then under the certain conditions and using the aniline catalyst, driving that reaction to get this linkage and the hydrazone bond that you can then quantify. The particular one kit that there's a bit of a standout here is the fluorescein antibody kit, and I've got a couple of key points there about it. It actually does not use HiNic and 4FB, so it's a bit of an outlier. It actually uses an NHS fluorescein to perform the conjugation. But nonetheless, this particular kit, it is a complete kit that enables labeling and purification within about 90 minutes. So that might be of interest to some investigators out there. Some of the other applications that these kits would be used for, here are these fluorophore antibody conjugation kits. Probably flow cytometry would be a very popular methodology. Can certainly be used for blood cell lysers, various immunoassays, and the peroxidase conjugated, the peroxidase antibody conjugate kit, certainly for very similar applications as well. Immunoassays could be something such as an LE spot, I've got there, or maybe a lateral flow assay. One further kit I'd like to draw your attention to is a protein-protein kit, whereby, let's just say, I don't know, maybe you want to conjugate a hormone with a fluorophore or an enzyme or something like that, or maybe just, BSA, for example, or albumin as a control with whatever it might be. Certainly this particular kit does incorporate the use of HiNic and 4FB as well, and enables that hydrazone linkage to occur. And some examples of applications would be in vitro assays. And I do have an example here of an antibody, whether it be a primary or secondary to a novel enzyme or a fluorophore, but also in vivo assays. And we did touch a little bit on these ADCs or antibody drug conjugates in one of those case studies earlier on. Indeed, it could be an antibody digest. There's a lot of work going on with antibodies, an FAB, FAB2 or something like that, to various drugs or whatever it might be. So hopefully this is giving you some ideas about how bioconjugation could potentially be looked at through a different lens. Let me put it that way. All right, this brings us to the oligoconjugation kits, and there's two choices. One is a protein oligonucleotide kit, and the other one is an antibody oligonucleotide conjugation kit. And both of these use, again, the HiNiC 4FB linkage technology. You do get this hydrazone bond that allows you for quantification of the conjugation to occur. And examples I've got here of where they might be used, and some of you may even be using these applications or techniques out there, proximal ligation assays, whereby you might have different antibodies labeled with different oligos, and when they're in close proximity, obviously you get that hybridization occurring. Similar would be an immuno-PCR reaction, and also targeted oligo delivery. And you know, I would say that that's probably something that's come into the forefront. And what do I mean by targeted oligo delivery would be, you know, maybe the use of something like an siRNA or like a small interfering RNA, which really acts, I'd say, through enzymatic breakdown of complementary mRNA, whereby you could then interfere or perturb, there's that word again, you know, various, you know, progression of cancer or something like that. And, you know, there's been, I'd say, a lot of work being done about how to extend the half-life of siRNA to be more of a targeted approach. So there's some interesting work going on about that, but that's where one of these oligonucleotide, you know, conjugation kits would be of interest. All right. Tips and tricks, or I've got here in the table do's and don'ts. So really quickly, do determine the antibody volume and concentration, and don't automatically assume that what's provided to you by a vendor is actually the correct volume or indeed concentration. You know, the vendor might be overfilling the material by a 5 or 10%, so that so that you're guaranteed of getting whatever it is concentration they say you're getting. So make sure that you do then validate that, make sure you adjust the volume and concentration as required, and work within the given parameters as per the kit instructions. Don't use too little, don't use too much. Get into that sweet spot of volume and concentration. Do remove preservatives, and what I mean by that is things such as azides or antimicrobial agents that may interfere with the conjugation. And don't automatically assume that, oh, my antibody's purified, I can continue straight away with the bioconjugation. You know, some of these purified antibodies may be supplied in buffer with carrier proteins such as a BSA, or indeed I've got here other amine molecules. And what I mean by that is contaminants or indeed buffers, like a tris-based buffer is how the antibody is supplied, which tris can be actually conjugated. So through the use of, you know, NHS esters or something like that. So just get rid of those before you continue with the bioconjugation. Certainly, if you are using oligonucleotides or peptides, you know, ensure the appropriate purity that it's been run through HPLC, for example, and modified. So, for example, don't use, I would call it dirty material, you know, something from a serum bleed or something like that. And certainly for the HiNiC and 4FB conjugation methodology, make sure they are amine modified so that you can link the 4FB onto those, or the HiNiC onto those given molecules. And at the end, I would highly recommend removing unincorporated label. And don't leave it around. You know, that can cause a lot of problems with perhaps interference with binding subsequently, or high background or something like that. So do remove the unincorporated label. All right, this brings us to the end here. We do have some tools and resources available on our website. You can access these through this particular linkage. We've got a white paper here talking a little bit more in depth about the SoluLINK technology. And we've recently made available a bioconjugation resource guide that highlights the products and kits I've just spoken about, but also some of the separate linkers and magnetic beads that are available as well. Some of the other tools and resources available on our website, we've got product manuals, online calculators I've listed here that you can, that I should say would make the process a little easier for bioconjugation. Troubleshooting guides, you can go through and make sure that everything is looking as you would expect. We're building out an FAQ section, and we do have some published references available as well. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the presentation, and with that in mind, now with the information I've bestowed upon you, go forth and conjugate with confidence, but I'll open the floor up now to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig, for that great presentation. We will proceed with the Q&A.